Hey guys, Dave from Nerdarchy, for Nerds by Nerds, hanging out with a couple of nerds. I got our chief and editor from Nerdarchy.com, Ty Johnson, with us today. And we also have Scott Fitzgerald Gray in the house as well. And I was lucky enough to have Ty point me in Scott's direction. And I was checking out the stuff that you're involved with, and there is a lot of it, in both on the design end, editing end, writing end. So you've been around for a little while, but I'm not surprised because, Ty, and Ty's kind of an old guy.
Oh, oh, thanks a whole lot. Uh, yeah. Well, I'm Ty Johnston, editor over at the Nerdarchy.com site. And I'll kind of introduce, this is Scott Fitzgerald Gray. If the way I kind of usually point out people or point people towards Scott is I'll say pick up any 5th edition core rulebook, flip to the sort of the index page and stuff, and it has a list of people that work there and usually or who worked on the product. Usually somewhere at the top under editors, you will see Scott Fitzgerald Gray.
Yeah.
Besides working on the 5th edition for D&D, Scott has done plenty of work back on earlier editions of Dungeons and Dragons. He's also done other work in for other gaming entities, and is an author of his own. I've read some of his material. Probably my favorite is his sort of sci-fi techno thriller called We Can Be Heroes. I would definitely suggest anyone look that up over on Amazon or wherever you purchase books. And I will turn it over to Scott and Dave now. Did I forget anything, Scott?
Nope, that's covers just about everything. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for the invite. I'm glad to be here.
I've been battling social media networks to get at you, but with Ty's help, we made it work. We made it work.
Yeah.
The hardest thing is a lot of people on Facebook, unless you're connected with them, you can't actually message them. It goes into that other bin and gets lost.
Yeah.
So how long have you been working in the industry as an editor?
Yeah, I've been working in the industry since 2004. The first book that I worked on was for Wizards of the Coast, and that was the supplement called Complete Arcane. I edited about half of that. That was my first assignment for them. They apparently liked what I did, so they kept coming back to me. For 3.5 era, I did a lot of work on the Eberron line. I think I worked on about half of those books, most as editor, and then I was a designer on 2 of them, Dragons of Eberron and Secrets of Sorlona, both of which were pretty cool to work on. Kept on going through 4th edition, worked on a lot of 4E stuff. Didn't work on any of the core stuff for the initial release, but I did work on the sort of the secondary release, the D&D Essentials line, where it was a little bit revamped down into the smaller books and such. Worked on Dragon and Dungeon magazines when they were online. And then when they made the switch to D&D Next, did a fair bit of work on stuff during the playtest period. Did a lot of conversions, did a lot of D&D Encounters stuff, adventures for the in-store play program. And then was asked to work on the core books for 5th edition, which was a huge thrill. And actually kind of unexpected, just because previously for 4th edition, they'd done they'd done everything in-house. And I started working on 4th edition pretty early, before the game was actually released, but I hadn't worked on any of the core stuff. Everything was really quiet for me as far as freelance stuff from WotC at that point in time. So being asked to work on the 5th edition core books was a real thrill. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I feel a little guilty, and I'm sure like many people that are probably in the chat watching now, they probably own a ton of the books that you've worked on and didn't actually know who you are. So it is cool for us to be able to bring you on and be like, hey, all those books that are sitting on your shelf, this guy's touched them. So so thank you for your hard work and your editing. Appreciated.
Yeah.
So what has been your favorite projects to work on? Like, do you have
Sorry, I lost your question there. There was just a bit of a lag.
Yeah. So do you prefer writing, designing, editing?
I actually prefer a combination of all 3, I think. I really love writing. It's something that I've been very passionate about for, even since before I started editing. I got into editing mostly because I worked in publishing for a long time. But I worked mostly on the graphics and the IT side of publishing, except I worked alongside a number of exceptional editors for a number of years, and because of the, working with them and learning a lot of stuff about the process just through osmosis, and then being able to apply that through my own writing, that kind of led me into editing, which I think is probably a little bit unusual. A lot of people who kind of, choose to be editing, that's sort of an initial focus for them. But I like the mix. I like the fact that working on other people's stuff in a lot of ways energizes me for working on my own stuff. Working on my own stuff, there, as Ty or any other writer can tell you, eventually at some point you hit a wall where you just feel like you're just kind of slogging and you're just sort of saying the same things over and over again. And for me, the act of working with other people's stuff, getting in touch with what other people are doing and their process really energizes my own process. So I have a lot of fun editing other people's stuff. I like being able to work with other people's ideas, and fine tune them, and to work with other writers and other designers, ideally, to sort of, take some really good ideas and, talk about ways to make them better ideas, because I can then apply that same process to my own work. And I think that makes my own writing better in the end.
Yeah, right. I'll add on to that. Yeah, writing, there's the old saying that it's a lonely process, and it really is in a lot of ways. And it's a lot harder to sort of set your own deadlines if you're only responsible to yourself.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with other people, you use the exact word, it energizes you. It definitely, it kickstarts your mind, gets you going. And to some extent, that's kind of what editors do in general, whatever type of editor they are, and it can help your own personal projects later on down the road.
Yeah.
Because like you said, you can hit a wall, maybe you're just bored or you feel like you're doing the same thing over and over again. You go work with other people. Again, you get energized and you come back to your own stuff eventually.
Yeah.
And it'll be better for it.
Yeah.
Did you start off working like in the gaming industry? Did you come from outside in, or was that like always the target?
I came very much from the outside, and it was very much a surprise, actually. This is a ridiculous confession to make, but prior to 2004, I honestly didn't know that, the bigger gaming companies like Wizards of the Coast, actually used freelance editors. I'd always just assumed that they had their in-house people, because my own experience was working for newspapers and magazines, you have an editorial department, you have an editorial team, you may freelance design stuff or writing, but all of the actual final process, that's all handled internally. And I was way back, and this is way back like in 2003, I was gaming at the time, and I was interested in gaming, so I was sort of following the industry and reading different people. And Sue Wainlin, who at the time was running Malhavoc Games with Monty Cook, had a blog, and on her blog she said, "Hey, I've heard that Wizards of the Coast is looking for freelance editors. People should contact Chris Perkins." And I did. And much to my surprise, Chris was actually pretty amazing, because he did the thing that people very often don't do if they're being cold called or cold emailed. He emailed me back to say, "Actually, I'm not the person you should speak to. You need to send this to Kim Mohan." He said, "I've already sent this to Kim Mohan for you. I forwarded, so don't worry about that." And then he also gave me the best advice, which was, he said, "You have to continually harass Kim to get him to follow up. Otherwise, you'll never hear from him again." So I did that, and that was something I might not have otherwise done, because I'm a sort of person who, like, if I email you 2 or 3 times and I don't respond, I'm like, fine, I've got other people I can email, right? So I did, and Kim got back to me, sent me an editing test, liked what I could do, and then Complete Arcane was the result of that. But it wasn't something I'd ever thought about doing, even though it was something I definitely would have aspired to do. Being from Canada, back in the day, like when I was working in publishing, I didn't have any expectations of, hey, I should, pack up and, move to Lake Geneva and try to work for TSR, because I'm a Canadian, I don't have a green card. It was just, there's too many insurmountable issues, even though if somebody had offered me that job, I would have jumped at it in a minute. But it had always just been so far off my radar, I hadn't even thought about it. And so when I started doing it, it was the biggest thrill you could possibly imagine.
That's pretty cool. It's funny. I think I actually got the same email either from Chris or Mike. I'm not sure which one I had emailed when I was harassing them as Nerdarchy, pretty much, to
Right.
looking for them. Although apparently I did not send enough emails to the other person. But very very cool. So that's all. That's pretty exciting to how you fell into the niches professionally from being basically a hobbyist.
Yeah, it really was. It was kind of an interesting. I mean, Kim who was managing editor at WotC for many years. He retired just a few years ago, though he's still actually working. He's still doing some freelance stuff, but he's very much an old school guy. So the editing test that he sent me was on paper, and you had to mark it. Yeah, Ty knows what that's like. And you had to mark it up using actual proofreader symbols, So he was automatically excluding a whole bunch of people from the test who wouldn't necessarily have known how to do that, because you would have had sort of like a skill set going back a few years, before people started doing all of their editing online, in Quark and Microsoft Word and all that sort of thing. Like even people who are really, really good, working in a newsroom, working on a magazine, a lot of them have never done actual paper copy editing, because it's kind of a dying art, but because I had done it, because I knew what it was, I was able to kind of do that. Right.
Probably. Yeah, I was going to say, I wonder if they even teach copy editing marking in like or anything anymore.
I'm pretty sure they still do. I know a few people through my daughter who are doing journalism. I think they kind of pay a certain amount of lip service, the way it used to be done. Just so you kind of know, historically, the way that the way people used to work. But certainly it's something that even a good hot 20-year-old editor at the time probably wouldn't have been able to keep up with that, or would have had to do a lot of research online to figure out what am I supposed to be doing with this. But I was in kind of a unique position, being a kind of a semi-middle-aged person even at that point, who had way too much experience with stuff, where I could actually turn that to my advantage.
So one of our patrons had asked, Brad Scary, what was your favorite project you've worked on?
My favorite project that I worked on, hands down, were actually two, which kind of go hand in hand. I worked on two different versions of the Tomb of Horrors for 4th edition. There was a super adventure, which Ari Marmol was lead designer on. And I did about half the book working under him. And that was a huge amount of fun, because we got to kind of write a sequel to Tomb of Horrors. There was the original Tomb of Horrors, and then for 2nd edition, Bruce Cordell did an amazing box set called Return to the Tomb of Horrors, which, if most people aren't familiar with, you should really familiarize yourself with it. I'm pretty sure you can buy it in PDF. I think it's on DM's Guild. But it was an amazing piece, because it kind of took that, kind of relatively thin story of the original adventure and expanded it into an entire campaign, with an amazing amount of backstory and great hooks, and really just some great writing. And so for the super adventure, we got to basically say, okay, let's, what happened 20, 30 years after that? And we were able to sort of expand that. And that was a huge amount of fun. But what was even more of a thrill was, at the same time, I pitched them on the idea of, and was given permission to, do a 4th edition conversion of the original Tomb of Horrors. So just take the original adventure and just do a straight up adaptation of it to 4th edition. But in the course of doing that, really had to really put a lot into it to make sure that it wasn't just sort of, the original adventure with new stats, but to take what there was there and to sort of reshape it in certain ways, and to make it actually fit the 4th edition rule set. Because 4th edition did a lot of things that were not simpatico with what AD&D was doing back in the day. One example was the very end. I don't think this is a spoiler, but the last fight in the original Tomb takes place in like a 20 by 20 room, right? And that doesn't really work for 4th edition. 4th edition, you needed a lot of space. You needed lots of room for doing tactical stuff. So I came up with what I think was a pretty cool idea for doing that without actually adding new rooms to the setup. So just making use of what was in the original, but sort of reapplying it in different ways. So those two things definitely far and away were the most fun I ever had working as a designer. As an editor working on the 5th edition core books, working as the editor on the Monster Manual specifically, that would be far and away the coolest thing I've done.
Nice. I would imagine converting 4th edition over to AD&D, or I mean AD&D over to 4th edition, would have been a bear mechanically. Like they're night and day. They're so different.
Well,
yeah.
And Tomb of Horrors, back the old first edition Tome, or what we call first edition Tome of Horrors, I mean, it really does deserve the reputation it's gotten over the decades,
Yeah.
because there's even a few places in there where there's no save or anything. You basically, if your character does something, they're dead.
Yep.
Not a save. There's not a second chance. It's just, you're dead.
Yep.
You know.
Were you able to maintain that, or did you have to?
No, I absolutely maintained it. Mechanically, yeah, things are quite a bit different. For me, working with adaptations like that, really what it comes down to often is thinking kind of beyond the mechanics and going back to what the intent is. You know, thinking about, okay, you know, what is this? You know, what are the players supposed to be feeling during this particular encounter? You know, what should they be going through emotionally and mentally, especially for something like the Tomb of Horrors, which is very much an adventure that's as much about challenging players as it is about challenging characters. You know, so that kind of inflected it a lot. When Ari and I were working on the Super Adventure, there was a lot of discussion about, it's 4th edition, you know, you don't have save or die anymore, this is going to be really lame. And we came up with the idea of explaining to people, you know what, the worst thing that can happen to your character is not dying quickly. The worst thing that can happen to your character is dying slowly. Like 3 or 4 rounds, you know you're dying and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. So we played around with that idea quite a lot, because 4th edition did that. It's like, you say, you know, you fail your first save, something bad happens. You fail your second save, something worse happens. And we just kind of embraced that mechanic with the Super Adventure and just sort of, you know, kind of cranked it up to about 12.5 in some cases and had a lot of fun with that.
That I could definitely see how that would work, you know, eking out the suspense over it, knowing like, well, is this the role where my character bites it or not?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sure, like, if they don't actually know how the effect progresses as well, like, is the next role the role that kills me or not?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can also have lots of fun just with environmental stuff as well. Like, you know, there's lots of things that kind of transcend edition in the sense that you can just use them to mess around with characters and to mess around with players, you know, and the mechanics are really kind of secondary, you know, things like, you know, rooms that turn upside down when you're not expecting them to, you know, pit traps that are like 150 feet deep. It's like, it doesn't really matter, you know, if you're rolling a D6 for falling damage or a D10 for falling damage, you know, AD&D versus 4th edition, it's still bad stuff is happening, right? So you can kind of play around. There's lots of I think there's a lot more crossover between the editions than people think about, because if you move past the mechanics a little bit, if you think more about, you know, not what the actual mechanics are, you know, like what a saving throw means in different editions and what the attack math is, you know, in AD&D versus 3.5 versus 4th edition versus 5th edition, but just work with the underlying idea of what is this encounter supposed to feel like? You know, what should the players be experiencing as a result of these die rolls and these rules that you're setting down? I think if you keep that in mind, that's it's a good kind of a common touchstone between all the different editions of the game.
Now, you know, I've played all the editions, and, you know, some I like better than others, but I never was able to muster the angst or anger or hatred towards any particular edition the way other folks have. And I really enjoy pointing out the things from 4th edition that have kind of worked their way into 5th edition, but they've done it kind of in a sneaky way.
Yeah.
For instance, like, a lot of the movement stuff is there, right?
Yep.
A lot of the effects that move things around on the board that we're not going to talk about in 5th edition are there. They just changed the terminology back.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, there was that change. That change kind of worked in a reverse way between 3.0 and 3.5, because 3.0 was originally set up along the idea that you could play with miniatures, but you didn't need to. You know, so a lot of their terminology was very much in the same manner of 5th. It was explained in a way that it was perfectly obvious what was happening if you were using a grid, but if you weren't using a grid, you could also just very easily adapt it, you know, to descriptive text, theater of mind, and that sort of thing. 3.5 kind of embraced miniatures wholeheartedly, as did 4th edition, and then 5th kind of moved back away from that a little bit. But I think it's interesting to me how much stuff that people don't like in certain editions, you know, and I'm totally okay with people, you know, say, you know, I didn't care for this edition. It felt, you know, too much like a, you know, different type of game. I didn't care for this edition because it was just, there was too many books. You know, I didn't want to have to buy this entire set in order to keep up with all the newest options. You know, I've total respect for that, but so many things that people try to dislike or that they talk about disliking actually existed previously and they just didn't notice. A surprising amount of the stuff that worked its way into 4th edition appears in the 3.5 Unearthed Arcana book, which a lot of people just don't think about, like unless you know that book really well, unless you've read it kind of cover to cover. There's tons of stuff in there that is really, really similar to what happened in 4th. Skill challenges being one of those. The terminology was slightly different and the mechanics were not quite exactly the same. But Unearthed Arcana had rules for doing skill challenges, for turning, skill checks into a complex thing where you're doing multiple checks and you're, comparing the DCs to this, that, and the other thing, and and you're succeeding or failing as a group. That was, that was right there in 3.5 if you wanted to use it. 4th edition just said, hey, this is kind of cool, and let's embrace that.
That is probably like one of the 2 things that I missed from 4th that I thought were really cool innovations to the game that just didn't really make the cut to 5th, and that was skill challenges and the minions.
Yeah. I think part of the problem with skill challenges for me, and this might be a little bit too much inside baseball, but skill challenges got to the point, I think, in later adventures where they just simply got too flatly mechanical, where it was just a matter of saying, okay, make these 5 checks, figure out who succeeds and fails, and that's basically it. And if you fail, then, here's a backup mechanic where you can get through that door anyway, because it's important that you have to get through this door at some point, right? In the very first edition of the rules for 4th edition, which I got a copy of just as I think I've still got them on my shelf somewhere, like a spiral bound notebook, like of each version of each 3, just, printed out on the laser printer and just, put together, which we were using to work on the first adventures and such that were coming out for 4th, right? Skill challenges had a very subtle difference between how they finally appeared when the player's handbook and the DM guide first came out. And that difference was when in their final appearance, the idea was that you had 3 different DCs. You had like the easy check, the moderate check, the hard check, I think it was called, and different checks in the skill challenge would have to meet or exceed one of those, right? So one type of check might be easy, one type of check might be moderate, one type of check might be hard. And you would basically just rack up successes or failures as a result of that. In the very original conception of skill challenges, there was no fixed DC. Okay, the idea was you would make the check result and the DM would simply compare it and see whether that was a minimal success. Okay, it beat the easy threshold, a sort of a mid success beating the moderate threshold, or an exceptional success that beat the high threshold. And the idea was that all you needed to get a success in the challenge was to beat the minimal threshold. But if you only beat the minimal threshold, you get a success, but something bad would happen on the side. If you beat the moderate threshold, that was a straight up success, everything was okay. If you beat the exceptional threshold, you would get a success, but something good would happen. And the thing that I loved about that, and the thing that I really missed about skill challenges as they finally appeared, was that the original application of it had so many narrative angles you could play with it. It basically kept the DM involved in the sense of having to constantly reshape the encounter by throwing in narrative elements. Okay, like you're trying to, I don't know, open up this really, really complex lock while there's combat going on all around you, right? If you get the minimal success, you're like, okay, you break through the first seal on the lock, but in so doing, you break something on the lock, and you now have to figure out how to, make the check in a slightly different way. Right. If you're trying to do a social skill challenge, right, where you're talking to the king or whatever, if you get the minimal success, the king believes what you're saying, but from the corner of your eye, you can see his castellan is looking at you like, yeah, I'm not buying this at all. Right. Unless you come up with a better story, I'm going to step up and I'm going to start talking too. That kind of stuff. And I think that's more interesting for me. But by the same token, it's definitely harder for a DM to run, especially a new DM, because you've really got to kind of be on top of the improvisational angle. And that's something else that 4th edition, I think, steered away from to some degree. So I understand why the change was made, but I think it was an unfortunate one because I think skill challenges were much more interesting the way they were originally presented, which I suspect very few people have probably actually seen.
Now, you just literally described the Fantasy Flight Star Wars narrative dice.
Yeah.
Pretty much, which is basically works off of the very same principles. They just use symbology instead of, thresholds.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Pretty much exactly how that works.
Yeah, I think there's lots of different, there's so many mechanics that sort of, mechanically, you're trying to do the same thing, but in different ways. Like all games, I think ultimately have the same, or most games, I should say, have a very sort of a narrow set of constraints that you're trying to work within, right? Because ultimately, the goal of most RPGs is for players to have a really good time. You know, it needs to be exciting. You need to be able to build an exciting narrative that everybody's engaged in, everybody's involved with, right? And it's just a matter of, you know, figuring out different ways to accomplish that in a lot of cases. And I think a lot of games, there are some games that do things that are very, very unique, but I think most games are built along sort of a broader pool of mechanics where you can look at that and you can say, hey, that's very similar to what this other game is doing. Because at the end of the day, both those games have to accomplish the same thing in terms of engaging the players, you know, and making the narrative exciting.
Now I'm going to dive into the chat a little bit here. They've been asking some questions. Some crazier than others. Scott Garibay, he's one of our staff writers that might be insane sometimes, but we love him anyway.
Yeah.
Justin asked, as an editor, when do you know when to say, okay, this is your shit, let's leave it as is, and when to say, nope, we have to change this?
The answer to that question is complicated because it really depends on what kind of editing you're doing and who you're editing for. The best type of editing for me is when I'm able to work directly with a writer and a designer, you know, whether that's editing novels, whether that's editing screenplays, editing RPG stuff, you know, being able to actually sort of confab with someone to say, hey, you know, here's some questions I have about your work, you know, let's talk about it. I really, really like that because it puts you in a really good space of trying to get inside that person's head and figure out, you know, what they were trying to do. And if there's a difference, as there often is, between how they saw something playing out in their head and between how it actually worked out on the page. You know, because that's the thing that plagues all writers, myself included, right? That's the reason editors exist, is because there's a perfect version of everything in our head, right? And we absolutely understand how it's working, but when it gets down on the page, it falls apart in a lot of ways, right? I'm working on two things right now that are both a lot of fun for sort of smaller projects. There's a writer named Jacob Hurst who's put together a really awesome sandbox style setting adventure called Hot Springs Island. The Kickstarter just finished last month. I think a fair number of people might have heard of it. It's really cool. And I'm just doing some proofreading, sort of editorial work on it right now. You know, and he and I, like, I just, you know, like had a bunch of questions and notes and, you know, talking about style issues and things. And I just fired them off to him and he's going to read them. He'll email me back. We may do a hangout at some point if that's the easiest way for us to talk about stuff. Right. But in that case, I can say to him, you know, literally, as you said, you know, this is something here that I think is kind of problematic. You know, what do you know, here's some other options. What do you want to do with it? Right. And I really, really like that because it means that my job is about getting the finished product as close to what's in his head, you know, as it can possibly be. Doing another project for a guy named Alex Kammer, who runs Gamehole Con. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with Alex. He's writing adventures of his own. I edited the first one that he did last year. I'm editing the sequel to that right now. And it's the same sort of situation. You know, I'm talking to him a lot back and forth, you know, talking about, you know, here's an option, you know, maybe, you know, is this something you thought about? If not, you know, maybe this is something we could work in. And I really like that part of the process. Other times you don't have access to the writer or the designer, and that's a much trickier and often much more problematic form of editing. That sort of thing happens a lot working for bigger publishers. Like, for an example, for Wizards of the Coast, it's really unusual for me to be working with and have access to the original designer because the original designer finished his or her work on the book 3 months ago. And they're now working off on other things, right? And it's gone through another, like a round of internal editing and internal development by the time it gets to me, right? So if I have questions, they go back to people who themselves interacted with the designer in a lot of cases, right? But I don't have a direct line to that. So it's always often a matter of saying, okay, I'm going to try to guess what the original intent was. And in some cases, if the original intent isn't quite what we think it should be, we being, you know, me and the other people, the developer and the lead editor, the managing editor, right? If it's not exactly where we think it should be, then we have to make some changes. And even if those changes are things that the designer might not be happy with, right? We recognize that, you know, the book is sort of on another level by that point, right? Screenwriting is much the same way. If I'm doing story editing or script consulting on a script, it's usually working with a producer or a director or a development agency. and the writer is usually pretty far removed from the process by that point. So again, it's a matter sometimes of trying to sort of second guess what their intention was and to sort of balance that out against what you think the best expression, the best way for the project to move forward is.
We touched on this a little bit yesterday. We had we had all of our staff writers on for a chat, and Ty pretty much wrangles that herd of cats over there.
Mm-hmm.
They're all really great, and it talked about that a little bit to the effect of not weighing in their group chat and letting them flesh out their ideas for themselves and trying not to influence it, and letting them kind of have their lead.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that was for me. That's what I was talking about. Is the writers at Nerdarchy do a lot of off-screen talking amongst themselves. Let me put it that way. Through Facebook and stuff like that. And sometimes they get into a little bit of a heated. Sometimes it's just interesting, whatever. But I very rarely will weigh in, even though I read this stuff, because I'm the editor. Sort of like Dave was saying, I don't want to really influence somebody. I definitely don't want to make somebody afraid of writing something. If somebody writes something and I see a problem with it, I'll go back to it, but I don't want them to be afraid to try it in the first place.
Yeah.
So especially when we start getting into politics and religion and things like that, I will, or if we get into edition wars or whatever, I try to, I keep my opinions to myself. For the most part.
Drop down into the bunker.
Yeah. But one of the reasons I brought that up is I didn't want them to also think that I totally was oblivious and wasn't paying attention.
Sure.
Yeah, I know what's going on.
Dad's watching.
Yeah. Well, okay, maybe a drunk uncle. But while I've jumped in here for a second, I did want to ask Scott, how did you get into the whole screenplay biz?
Screenplay biz, once again, as with the RPG work, kind of a happy accident. One of the first jobs I got in publishing was working for a film trade magazine in Vancouver, where I was living at the time. And just in the course of that, got to know a fair number of film people, producers mostly, but also some writers, some directors, just sort of the local Vancouver scene, which this was back in the 80s. So this is when film in Vancouver was really just starting to take off.
Okay.
When sort of the outside production, the stuff that's really, really big now, this was kind of the lead up process to that. And in the course of doing that, met a number of writers who, were kind of like, hey, can you read my script? Let me know what you think about it. And I just started writing out notes for them and didn't understand until I was doing it that apparently I had a really good knack for breaking down story in that way, and actually saying, this is what's working, this is what's not working. And just kind of went off from there, started doing work for more development agencies primarily, which is something that American viewers might not know much about because we have a very different industry up here than we have down there. Down there, if you're like an indie writer, you're writing spec scripts a lot of the time, right? And you'll be trying to shop them to producers, production companies, agencies, management companies, that sort of thing. Up in Canada, because we have a very sort of a tenuous arts and culture industry up here because of the 300 million strong behemoth down south of our border. We have a lot of funding agencies, which are funded by partly the government, partly by our industry, like the big pay TV networks up here, like the equivalent of HBO and Showtime and that sort of thing. They put a certain amount of their money aside and they put it into development of Canadian scripts, Canadian films, that sort of thing. So I do a lot of reading for those agencies because those agencies are the people who writers and producers are sending their scripts into, wanting to get some development money to, do a second draft, bring it up to production quality and that sort of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So both Justin and Scott in the chat asked about, and we talked about a little bit before we got started. They wanted to know what games you're playing for fun.
For fun, I play Pathfinder Tuesday nights as a player. I've got a weekly game that I do Sunday where I'm running it, which is using actually a rule set kind of my own fiendish imagination. It's a kind of a 3.5 variant that's sort of I might do something with it at some point. It's in what you'd call closed beta right now, in the sense that I've just sort of been hacking away at the rules and sending them out to certain people and that sort of thing. It plays very much like 3.5 or Pathfinder, but it uses a slightly different framework for character setup and for character progression. But as far as the mechanics go, it's you wouldn't have any problem not recognizing it as a 3.5 variant. Those are pretty much my main games. I don't play a lot of computer games. I don't do any MMOs, even though I would like to have more time to do so, but my free time is in pretty short supply. And I know that if I started playing Skyrim or something like that, my free time would disappear, as would probably most of my income, because I would start doing nothing else. I spend a lot of time reading RPGs, much more. Like there are games that I've read and loved that I've never had a chance to play. I'd love to play them at some point if I ever have the opportunity to, but again, lack of free time and lack of other people willing to run games, which I think is a chronic problem for a lot of people who spend a lot of time GMing, is kind of an issue.
I can definitely relate to that. Although, for us now, it's gotten much easier. So apparently the secret to having a lot of other people willing to run games for you is create a mildly successful YouTube channel. And then they come out of the woodwork.
I'll have to work on that.
Yeah. It's no big deal. It should only take a couple of years.
Yeah.
So, although you probably have a head start.
Yeah. One of the things about being an editor is you really stay under the radar for a lot of people, which is both good and bad. I mean, it's a big advantage in the sense that, I don't have to deal with a lot of the stuff that I see friends of mine, people that I know who are much more high profile as designers and publishers dealing with on social media, because people know who they are. People know that they are strongly dedicated to those games, so they become sort of targets and lightning rods for people who have a beef with those games. And I'm just sort of like, hey man, just, nothing to see here, as I just sort of slide past, right? With people being totally unaware that the thing that that might really annoy them about their game or a particular adventure, that was me. I made that change, right? But yeah, go ahead and blame the writer, because that makes my life much easier. So yeah, it's like I do a little bit of stuff as a designer. The latest book from WotC, Tales from the Yawning Portal, actually has an adventure in it that I wrote for the D&D Next playtest, Dead in Thay. So that's gotten a little bit of notice, and some people are playing that and enjoying it, which is really gratifying. But as an editor, it's never happened to me that anybody said, hey, I love the editing on that book you did, right? Because if you're doing your job well as an editor, as many editors have said, nobody knows what you're doing, right? So your work should be completely invisible if it's done well.
Also, I would also add to that too, like even enough pats on the back from fans and well-wishers will knock you over. Yes. So those guys, not only the lightning rod for the negative stuff, but also the positive stuff can become overwhelming at times as well.
It can be for some people. I'm like a lot of writers, like a lot of, quote unquote creative people. I'm a little bit of an introvert, like I don't, I like hanging out with people. I like talking about games. I like doing, interviews, podcasts, what have you. But at the same time, I'm much more comfortable, not having to do that 24/7. And yeah, you're right. Just the being the subject of constant accolades would be nice. I think probably for about 4, maybe 5 minutes, and after that, it would start to get really wearying.
We're always asked to get Matt Mercer on, and like that poor guy is probably like hounded around the clock at this point.
No doubt, yeah.
And he's had about enough, And I've talked to people that are connected with him, and are like, yeah, he's hard to get to now on purpose because he's a really nice guy, and he needs balls, he needs walls and barriers, or else, he's committing himself to everything.
Yeah, exactly.
So. Kind of going off of, what do you like to play? So is your preferred system Pathfinder 3.5, or is that just happens to be what you're playing now?
It just happens to be what I'm playing now. The friend of mine who's running the Tuesday night game, Pathfinder is his game. That's the one he really likes. That's what he's got the most invested in terms of, books and resources and that sort of thing. So that's what he chooses to play, and that's fine by me. I love 5th edition a lot. I like 4th edition a lot. I think it would probably take a lot to get me back to playing 4th edition. Even though one of the other players in my Tuesday night game, he runs 4th edition still because that's his favorite game. He loves it. If he ever invited me to play, I'd be there for sure. But certainly, running a 4th edition campaign, I don't think is something I could do just because, having worked in it for as long as I have and having moved on to other things now, I'm kind of more interested in that. My preferred system is the one that I'm working on my own. And the reason for that is simply because it's a game that kind of reflects the way that I always wanted to play D&D, but never had the chance to, because nobody ever came up with a system quite the way that I wanted it to be set up. So that was sort of the impetus of doing that. It started off just as some house rules, just kind of tinkering with things and saying, instead of doing, A, B, and C, what happens if we do X, Y, and Z, or Z if you prefer. And it just sort of expanded from there into, not a set of house rules, but something actually at this point very much resembling a sort of a game of its own.
How long have you been working on that?
A ridiculously long length of time. I think I had to go back and check old emails and forum posts and such to figure out. I think we first started talking about it in like 2010, but it's not like I've been putting 40 hours a week on it, since that time, because that would be ridiculous. It's mostly just been, like as time comes up, when I have time to kind of mess around with it, I'll add a few new things, send it out, get feedback from people, get some responses, work with other people and stuff. Like I've got one friend of mine, one guy I know who's actually actively kind of creating new stuff for it as well with me, which is kind of cool because he's coming up with a lot of good ideas, which, I wouldn't have come up with on my own, or it would have taken me a lot longer to kind of get around to the stuff that he's doing. So that's kind of fun. So, I mean, that's part of the reason why I think it's at some point I need to kind of think about taking it into sort of like an open beta sort of setup to try to get more feedback on it and get more people sort of, figuring out if this is a game that they would like to play as well, or whether I'm, it's just me and the people that are playing it right now, whether we're the only ones with that particular mindset.
Cool.
Okay, I have to ask, this will be kind of an in joke, but we'll explain.
Sure.
Your home rules.
Yes.
Tell me you've got the firkin in there somewhere.
I don't think I've got around to editing that section yet, but it will be for sure.
Okay.
There'll be a full supplement on casks and barrels.
Okay.
Yeah.
For those who might not know, a firkin is kind of like a small keg.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Where this is coming from is, if you're old enough to have played AD&D, back to the 1st edition DM guide, there was these awesome tables in the back of random dungeon dressing and things you would find in rooms and that sort of stuff. And, none of it was valuable at all. It was mostly just, very much about the idea that as a DM, the more detail you can provide, the more real you make the encounter or the room or the scenario feel for the players. You're really sort of immersing them in it. But part of the problem was when Gary Gygax wrote the original book, he assumed that everybody had read all the same stuff he'd read. So he didn't bother explaining a lot of stuff. So in those tables, there was things like a hogshead and a cask and a butt and a firkin, with no explanation of what those things are. And I remember quite distinctly at some point playing, this is like in 11th or 12th grade, playing that and looking at the firkin and not knowing what a firkin was, and not having like immediate access to a dictionary because the dictionary was in the next room, and who's got that kind of energy, right? Back before the internet, and getting into argument like a firkin, isn't that like a dagger? It's like, no, isn't that a bodkin? It's like, no, is the bodkin because thinking about Shakespeare, right? Because you're reading that in grade 11, thinking, okay, like the bare bodkin, is that like the dagger, or is that like the armor and you're bearing it so you can be stabbed? And it's not having any idea what a firkin was. And so when I was editing the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition, lo and behold, I have the same table in front of me, right? Because they picked up the tables for the most part just absolutely intact, and they put them into the DM Guide's own, random dungeon dressing section. And so I thought, hey man, it's annotation time. So I went through and I explained what a firkin, small barrel, and it holds like 11 gallons, right? That's basically what it is, right? So I put down like all the volumes for the various casks and the various barrels, and made sure that everything was understandable, so that future generations of gamers will not have to go through that horrible process of not knowing what a firkin is.
Or just maybe they should have to. It's like a hazing.
Yeah.
Oh, we've already had 40 years of that. It's time to make it easy.
Yeah.
So Justin again asks, and I was actually thinking the same thing. If there was only a community that would run alpha or open beta for Scott.
Yeah. At some point, sooner, hopefully, than later. If and when it comes out, you'll definitely hear about it here. I'll make sure that you're kept in the loop.
And then Scott Garibay always likes to be controversial and wants to know what would you put in 6th edition Dungeons and Dragons? And guys, you can jump in the roll call if you want. I'm like, we just got 5th. What are you in 6th for?
Yeah, with the understanding that I don't think 6th edition is anywhere even close to being on the horizon, and I like 5th edition a lot. I think it does a really great job of sort of finding a balance between the various editions. Like, you can use 5th edition to play most types of D&D. If you're a really hardcore tactical gamer, you really loved 4th edition. And like I say, like, I know lots of people who still love and still play 4th. You can play that with 5th. If you like an old style game where, you don't have a grid, you don't have minis, it's all theater of the mind, you can do that with 5th, and that was, I think, a pretty monumental achievement. The one thing I would love to see with 6th was something that 5th edition didn't quite reach, I think. In the very, very early days of the play test, I don't remember who it was at WotC. It might have been Mike Merles, but I don't want to say that because I could be wrong about that. Talked about a vision for the game where you would have like a basic framework, and then you would have expansions and kits that you could add on to make it a more complicated, not complicated in the sense of arbitrary complication, but rules that would fit more tactically oriented players, right? And he talked about that as kind of like 2 discrete systems. Like, you'd have like the core system and then things that would get added onto it. And 5th edition has a lot of that in its DNA, I think. You can look at the core classes in the player's handbook and you can say, this is the simplest one to play. I've got my friend here. He's a noob. He's never played, tabletop game before. I'm going to set him up with, this fighter or this rogue or this barbarian, because he's just going to have to, think about, 3 different things that he does. And he's just going to, go to town and have a great time. And there's these other options where, I've got somebody who's played a lot of 4th, played a lot of other games. I'm going to give him this one because it's much more challenging. It's much more resource oriented, but that's the kind of stuff that he loves, and that's the kind of stuff he's used to. So you can play that sort of style, but the way that it was originally talked about, I got the impression that what 5th edition might have been was a game that really sort of had really sort of discrete aspects to it. And if I was, had like a wish list of stuff for 6, I would maybe say, this is a good idea, and maybe it's worth revisiting this to see if it's actually possible and feasible. And saying that, I acknowledge that, probably a big part of the reason it didn't happen with 5th was because they spent a lot of time working on it, and it turned out it wasn't practical or feasible because you just introduce more problems trying to set that up than you actually solve. But I still think it's an interesting philosophy.
Well, yeah, not only that, though, to think about it, if you look at the release schedule, to build the game that way would probably require a much heftier release schedule, and they've clearly steered away from that.
Yeah, I think that probably definitely had a lot to do with it as well. Like I'm just a freelancer for WotC. I've never worked in the office, so I have absolutely no inside information in terms of, why books get done, why they choose to work on A as opposed to B, that sort of thing, right? But yeah, definitely their focus as 5th is rolled out, which seems to be working pretty well, for them. Just focusing on the big adventures, keeping stuff like Unearthed Arcana online, right? So there's constantly new stuff coming out into the pipeline. People are playing it, people are testing it, people are hopefully, I think, having fun with it, Yeah, setting up that kind of initial structure with lots of kits, lots of add-ons would have been a very different type of publication process, and probably one that they looked at and just kind of bottom lined and said, what, this is going to require resources that we could better dedicate to other things.
So Brian Smith, a firkin sounds like a gnarly beast. Give it some lair actions. Now I'm going to jump in for our roll call. We got intern Kyle in Jersey. We got Scott in South Carolina. We have Nordic Dragon 89 in Dalarna, Sweden. We have Bunions and Dragons in Michigan. We got Justin in Japan. We got Rob in Seattle. AJ's in Lopez Island, Washington. We got Linking, and she jumped on me. We have Linking in Sweden. We have Daniel in the armpit of California, in case you're wondering. Dominic is coming to us from Fresno, California. Comic Book University Top Secret Weapon X program. So that should be up near you somewhere, Scott. We got Tom Harris in Indiana. We have Jimmy in Ventura, California. Regilio in Utah. We have Hat Von Moose in Luzern, Switzerland. Where are we going here? We have Brad Smith, Michigan. And where are we at now? What happens is we start talking and they start answering, so it gets mixed up. We got Poison in Kuwait. We got Evil Silly Putty in Minnesota. We have Brian F. in New York City. We have Tax Scarwing in New Mexico. Jose's in Tampa. Hey, Jose. We actually got to play with him back in January. So we got people weighing in all over the country, all over the world, as usual, which is always really cool.
That is cool.
So with that,
let me ask real quick. So Scott, are you working on any personal projects, any more books coming out or anything like that?
Yeah, hopefully. In bits and pieces, I've got the usual list of stuff that I want to work on is getting longer, just because the list of stuff that other people are asking me to work on is also getting longer, and that's always for me sort of the toughest part is trying to find a balance there. I try not to complain about that too much because I recognize that on every level I am the luckiest son of a bitch alive. Insofar as I'm getting,
I know that feeling.
Yeah, I work on a lot of really cool stuff, and I get to make a living from it, and that's really amazing. But it's at different points in time. Right now, being one of those points in time, I have enough projects coming in from other people that it's hard to find the time to work on my own stuff. I've got a few things up on DM's Guild. It's a pretty short list right now. It's supposed to be a much longer list. I got a ton of short adventures that I want to kind of finish up and get on there. I've got a bunch of magic item supplements that I want to do.
Yeah, I've got your one for potions and for rings. Is there?
Yeah, those are the only two that are up right now. I've got three more that are sort of partly. I've been working on them, but just don't have the time to sit down and complete them, and I need to focus more on that. I've got two novels that are I'm working on right now. I don't know which one I'm going to finish first. I think it depends on what sort of my frame of mind is, which sort of whether I'm more SF or more fantasy. And again, like both of those are things that I really wanted to have done like 2 years ago now at this point, which is frustrating. But yeah, lots of stuff. Lots of stuff on my own, but also lots of stuff for other people. So both are gratifying. It's just a matter of trying to find the balance.
Okay.
Now, Justin had actually been asking a lot of questions, and he's actually asked a lot of good questions. Mm-hmm. But one of his questions was, what do you have that you've worked on for yourself personally that'll probably never see the light of day? I guess he's thinking more like along the lines of design and like gaming.
I really don't know that there is an answer to that question right now. 5 years ago, I probably would have been able to come up with a list of stuff, but there's so many opportunities now for me to turn stuff that previously would have been never see the light of day project into things that I can just actually work on and release on my own. DM's Guild is one option that I use just because I'm doing like a lot of 5th edition stuff, and for me that's it's a nice place to go. But any of the various drive-through RPG sites, there's just so many opportunities to put stuff out there. There's so much good stuff out there, even though at the same time, there's a lot of stuff that's not quite so good. Virtually any idea that I've ever had and come up with where I thought, hey, that was really cool and you were really stupid because I pitched this to you and you said no, and I'll shake my fist. Right. If I come back to that at some point, I might look at that and say, hey, they were right. That really is a lame idea. What was I thinking? Or I can look at it and say, hey, you know what? I can actually turn that into something interesting. And again, if I just ever get the time to turn all the interesting things I have into interesting products, I can get them out there.
And that's one of the things about especially digital publishing, but publishing in general nowadays is, in the old days, a lot of projects, whether a book or a game or whatever, or screenplay, would get turned down, but it wasn't always necessarily because they were bad. It was maybe because it didn't fit a certain schedule at the time. Maybe it was because it didn't fit what the publisher, producer, whatever saw as their audience. So now there are, through self-publishing and independent publishing and small publishers and things, there's a much better chance of getting material like that out there.
Yeah.
You know, like I said, so, and you can put it out yourself if you're not working with a smaller house or whatever.
Yeah, actually, sorry, I can actually answer Justin's question properly because something just popped into my mind as Ty was speaking. One thing that I did write that I really liked, and which nothing happened with, and which nothing I don't think ever will happen with, I wrote a Ravenloft novel for Wizards of the Coast. This was this was just before 4th edition launch, so I guess that was like 2006, 2007. And they had some really interesting ideas for expanding the Ravenloft line in terms of fiction. And I was one of a number of authors who had been contracted to write books. And then they went through a process where they decided to just sort of downscale and to downsize the fiction line. And there were a couple of books that were actually fully completed, including mine, which just never saw the light of day. There were a few more writers involved who had kind of written outlines and stuff and were just working on stuff when the plug got pulled, you know, but I know of at least 2 books, mine and Airy Marmal, I think, wrote one, which were actually like, they're there and they're just, nothing's ever going to happen with them, you know, because that's not part of their plan anymore. But it was a damn good book. I was really proud of it and really happy.
Is it a book that Wizards, like, you wrote it and now Wizards owns it?
Basically, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's any design stuff that you do for a large company, at least, tends to always be contract work or what's called work for hire. I don't know if a lot of people understand that. Like I've got books out right now, you know, that are still available that I've worked on for WotC. And when you work on a book like that, you get paid a relatively large amount of money up front, and in exchange for that you don't get any rights to it, right? So you don't get any residuals, there's no royalties, that sort of thing. Very different scenario than publishing fiction. If that Ravenloft novel had been published, then I would have received royalties for it, right? For whatever it sold. But because it wasn't published, I basically got paid my upfront fee, got paid a kill fee, you know, and it was all fine. Like, it more than adequately covered the time that I put into it. You know, I was paid well for the book, and that's not an issue. But because the book wasn't published, that was basically the end of the road for that.
So I guess the reason I had asked is because I was just thinking, like, because you can technically put, I think Ravenloft's open in the DM's Guild now. So I was like, oh, if it's sitting on his hard drive, could he just put that novel right in there?
I know a number of people who had made noises about approaching WotC to see about publishing fiction on DM's Guild, and I think the answer's been no so far. They want to focus it exclusively on gaming stuff. Certainly, if that ever changes, then yeah, that's something I would definitely want to talk to them about.
And that was the other thing I wasn't completely sure about. And I guess the other thing too is, like, in the DM's Guild, like for I know you, there's you, and I've talked to other writers that actually want to put stuff in there. But they can't put what they want in there right now. Well, actually, we had Keith Baker on, and we talked about it on there, so I guess it doesn't matter. But he would love to put Eberron stuff in there, but he can't yet because there's no Eberron.
Because it's I think it's too bad. I mean, certainly I worked with Keith on 2 books. Well, I mean, I edited a bunch of stuff that Keith worked on, but then the 2 Eberron books that I worked on as a designer, he was lead designer on. He's an amazing creative guy and really a huge amount of fun to work with. I mean, I'd love to see Eberron stuff for 5th. You know, I can understand it from Wizards' perspective insofar as they need to keep a certain amount of control over what's out there and what's going on. You know, but at the same time, I would love to see more stuff out there. I'm hoping that at some point they can expand it, but still kind of, you know, keep that balance of being able to, you know, control what's out there and be happy with it, but also give more people much more free reign in terms of putting things out.
So I guess the question I was also getting to is, like, the DM's Guild to me seems like a really tough place if you're actually, you know, this is where you make your living. That marketplace, you know, it's undervalued as far as what a lot of the consumers are willing to pay because it's a PDF. And then, you know, on top of that, you know, RPG Drive Through RPG. They take their cuts. Wizard takes their cut,
Mhm.
and it leaves, I think, like 25% left for whoever's creating in there.
It's actually 50% right now, but it's still, yeah. I mean, it's not.
Oh, is it that high?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay, that's even better.
Yeah. When they initially launched, I think they were talking at 25%. Like I remember the first email that I got from them where they were just reaching out to certain creators. I think their initial thought was 25%, and they got some strong feedback about that not being enough. So they went to 50. I don't publish anything on Drive-Thru. I think Drive-Thru is 70. So it's sort of like a sliding scale that's better for the creator off of DM's Guild. But I think the implicit idea is a DM's Guild, you're getting access to stuff you wouldn't be able to necessarily do. That's certainly true for me. The little magic item PDFs that I'm putting on there, what I'm doing with those is I'm just taking all of the magic items that appeared in any core books that didn't make it into the 5th edition DM guide, and I'm writing them up for 5th edition. So I'm taking the actual things out of the AD&D Player's Handbook, the 2nd edition books, the 3.0 and 3.5 books, even some 4th edition stuff, and just saying, hey, this was pretty cool, so let's, figure out what it would look like if it was a 5th edition item. And that's something that I wouldn't be able to do on any other site without going to a lot more effort of sort of filing the serial numbers off, making sure things weren't recognizable as what they were being based on or inspired by. So for me, that's a lot of fun. So
yeah, actually, my issue isn't really with the businesses. Yeah. It's more with the community as a whole,
sure,
and the lack of respect for people that put their time and effort into working on stuff. They want everything for free or pay what you want or $1.
Yeah.
And then to that I look at, well, how much talent can we draw from if the marketplace is so low?
Yeah.
Guys like you and Keith, they really have to think twice about writing over there because their time to value ratio.
Mm-hmm.
And Ty keeps trying to jump in, so go ahead, Ty.
No, I was going to say that by the time sort of digital publishing hit the gaming world, kind of the trends had to some extent been set by digital publishing in the book publishing world. I mean, basically, when you get to the point where anybody can publish, it kind of affected the market to a certain way. There's good things about that. There's bad things about that. I mean, there's not even books, but there's whole series of books you can get on Amazon and buy for 99 cents or even less in some places. Again, there's good things and bad about it. If you're a reader, hey, that's great. If you're a publisher or a writer, that's not real good news. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of the market has worked out that way. And to a certain extent, I'm not going to blame anybody. It is what it is at this point. To a certain extent, that has been brought about by certain practices by those who make digital publishing available. Mm-hmm. Whether it's Drive Through RPG or it's Amazon or whatever. Again, and I don't mean to pick on anybody or, they've got reasons. They're all successful. They've got reasons for doing their business their way. Mm-hmm. And as as somebody who makes a certain portion of my living self-published, you just got to work a little harder, mm-hmm. And you've got to be, and honestly, sometimes you got to be willing to make less on certain projects if you're going to be able to make more for on another project, maybe. Yeah. I mean, if something's really personal to you or whatever, then maybe you won't worry so much about, I got to get a big paycheck for this. But that's just my opinion, and every writer's going to have a different one.
Personally, I blame Steve Jobs. But no, but you know what? At the end of the day, though, it becomes us, the consumer's problem, because we're creating this environment where people are like, talented people aren't going to work there because they can't feed themselves or their families. And for some reason, as a community that seems to be more cerebral than most, they still don't seem to get that. They don't get it. At the end of the day, you get what you pay for.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really good analysis. And so far as, sorry, I don't know if you can hear that or not.
It's okay.
My dogs.
We're animal friendly.
Yeah. It's a really good analysis. And you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a real sense of, there's a strange sense of reluctance among some people in the community to spend money on good product. And I can understand that on some level because there's so much cool stuff out there. And if you bought everything that you could possibly buy that looked interesting, you'd buy nothing else. It would be like, hey, I'm out of money for food this week, you know, but look at my shelves, right? And I've been there, you know, I'm still there now to some degree. I get my Amazon statement. I'm like, boy, there's an awful lot of Kickstarter stuff on here, right? I think part of the thing, and Ty can certainly speak to this, you know, as well or better than I can, is one of the things about this sort of endeavor is thinking about it in terms of the time frame. Certainly, if there's anybody out there who's thinking, I've got this amazing adventure, I've got this amazing class supplement, I'm going to publish it on DM's Guild, and I expect to make this much amount of money. There's nothing wrong with that, but you got to think to yourself, what time frame am I expecting to make that much money over? Right? Because you're not going to probably make it the first week. You know, like if you can put something on there and it, you know, pops up to platinum bestseller, whether on, you know, Drive-Thru or DM's Guild or any of the, you know, Amazon or wherever, that's great, but that's probably not going to happen. What you're looking at instead is saying, okay, I'm going to make a small amount of money over a long period of time. Right? And I'm going to try to adjust that by getting more product out so that people who see my old stuff will buy my new stuff. People who see the new stuff will say, hey, what else has this guy got out there? And that sort of thing. I mean, I've failed pretty spectacularly on that front on DM's Guild, just because, as I said earlier, I've got a lot more stuff I'd love to get out there, and I'm just struggling to find the time to actually put it together, you know. But certainly, you know, like if you've got, you know, one project out there, one product out, you're going to get minimal returns. If you've got 5, you're going to do better. If you've got 10, then, you know, over the long term, you might be okay. Certainly there's stuff on the bestseller list of DM's Guild, like, you know, surprising to me, there's a lot of stuff in the top tier that are not necessarily cheap. They're not necessarily undervalued. Like they're PDFs that are going for $10, $9.99 in a lot of cases, right? So people, I think, are certainly willing to spend the money if there's something there that they're interested in. It's just a matter of what you can do as a creator and a publisher, a self-publisher, to make sure that you're making people interested in your work and that you're giving them more opportunities to find the rest of your work once they've found one particular piece.
Well, you kind of just get it, Ty.
Well, that one of the things a lot of people who work in publishing today as freelancers, whether you're a writer or editor or kind of who wears a jack of all trades, is diversify what you do. Is don't have, you know, all your apples in one basket. Work, you know, you can do some self-publishing. You can do some publishing with a book publisher. You can work with a game publisher. You know, if this is something like you're wanting to make a living at, sure, you might be the next Stephen King and get lucky in your first book and you can live off that the rest of your life. But that's not likely to happen. So I would, one thing I tell potential or upcoming writers or whatever is have a lot of different kind of projects going. Don't just put everything into one hat.
So Scott, one of the things you were saying is like, I have a lot more things I'd like to put there, but I don't have time. And like, if I read between the lines, I go, he's got a lot more things he'd like to put there, but there's other things that pay him much better for his time. You know, and that's to the point that I kind of speak to. And like, you know, we try and bring that up often with our audiences. You know, we try and tell them, no, you really need to buy books and not download them illegally. You need to support the hobby if you want to have a hobby to enjoy.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think you're absolutely right there. I mean, certainly there's, you know, there's so much stuff out there now that's available. There's so much good stuff that, you know, that people should be buying. It's disappointing sometimes. It's okay. You know, when people choose to specifically not buy stuff, almost like as a badge of honor, you know, like I have this entire collection of PDFs and I didn't pay for any of it, you know, like that's something that they're proud of. And, you know, that's something I have a hard time getting behind. Just because ultimately at the end of the day, you're right. If people want a hobby, if people want an industry, right, then they need to support it. You know, it needs to be able to sustain itself.
Totally agree. And you know what, you know, and not only that, but the people behind that industry too, because, you know, that's what it comes down to. Like, you know, everyone's got bills, everyone has to feed their families. And you know what, not only do I want you guys to be able to produce products for me to buy, but I also want you guys to have a decent life too. And not have to, you know, live somewhere as cloistered like monks in order to, you know, sustain the hobby.
Yeah.
But you know, thank you for coming on. Appreciate it. I said an hour. We're a little bit over an hour now. Thank you for hanging out with. chat and chattering away amongst yourselves and asking great questions. I do appreciate it. So until next time, everybody, stay nerdy.
Stay
All right.
nerdy.
Thank you. Thanks.